Parents, what spooky past life memory did your kid utter? This is the second installation in the past life series. So far, this is probably one of my favorite threads I have ever read. If you have any stories similar to this, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Answer for my parents. When I was 4, my parents and I went to my aunt's farm. The wind started picking up and I looked back at my parents and said, "Gotta tie the hay bale down in the wind." That's how David died. To this day no one knows who David is. My son said once, "Mommy, when I was big and you were little, I remember when we danced in the kitchen." The only person I ever danced in a kitchen with as a child was my grandfather. Not a parent, but when I was young I used to have a recurring dream where I was a Roman archer trying to fend off an attack from what looked like the Mongols. I would describe the armor and weapons to my parents without having seen them myself yet. At the time, I didn't know it was Roman armor, or Mongolian clothing and weapons. Once I did finally see the armor for myself, I was like, oh yeah, that's the armor in my dreams. I remember vividly that I was in a small line of archers next to a fort that had a tree right next to it, and the invaders came out of a seemingly dense forest on horseback. There was also a very slight hill going down from the tree, to my left. The attackers were wearing some furs and had curved swords. They easily passed through the foot soldiers, and most of our arrows missed. I remember getting struck by the sword from the man in the front, on the left side of my head. Coincidentally, there is a single gray hair that grows in the exact spot I remember getting struck. Whenever my hair would grow out a little, that gray one would show up. I've tried searching for this fort through various Google image searches, but I've only found a couple that seem similar. I don't have the dream anymore, but I can still remember what everything looked like. I used to watch my nephew when he was about 3 or 4. One day he was at my house and pointed to a magnet of Arizona. It had a picture of the desert with rock formations. Kid pointed at it and asked where it was. He said he used to live by red rocks like that with his first family who all had straight, dark hair, his is blonde and curly. Now, and that he had a mom and a dad and he had a brother until he went too far into the desert too close to dark and got eaten by not dogs, not wolves but smaller. I said coyotes? And he kind of mouthed the word and said, "Oh, that's what you call them." Then he was sad and didn't want to talk about it anymore, so we had lunch and that was the first and last time he mentioned it. I'm the kid in this case. I don't believe in the paranormal. I'm a pretty reasonable guy. I have degrees in science and healthcare, and I'm pretty grounded. But since I was a child, I had a memory of me stumbling out the back door of a club. I couldn't hold myself, either really drunk or on drugs, and I slipped down a staircase, hit my head in the alley and died. I was about 19, I was thin, had long blonde hair, I was wearing a brown red leather jacket. I remember the neon signs, the staircase, the door I walked out of, even the interior. I can paint the picture perfectly if I had any talent in art. Anyways. So 2 years ago, I took a leisure trip to Budapest, and while exploring the ruined pubs with my wife, I found the frickin' alley. It was funny because I remarked to my wife earlier, when we arrived, that I felt something about Budapest that felt like home and familiar, and I felt oddly too comfortable there, like I could have never left. I think about this quite often. Didn't believe in ghosts until this day, but it's fair to say that now I have a slightly more open mind. Our 2 to 3-year-old daughter was playing on her own, but she was playing hide and seek with an imaginary friend. I asked, "Are you playing hide and seek?" She said yes. "Who are you playing with?" "Uncle Andrew." My wife's brother Andrew was 7 when he drowned when my wife was 5. Didn't like to talk about it, so we never mentioned it. This was told to me by my parents. When I was 6 or so, my dad was watching a war documentary and it talked about a tube. I then said, "You mean the tube from when I was a grown-up?" My dad asked me to explain more and I said me and another person was put in a tube with a knife and was tasked to kill the other person, but I got stabbed in the chest. He says it still keeps him up at night. According to my dad, when I was around 5 I was staring out of the window during a heavy thunderstorm. When he asked me what I was doing, I answered, "When do the bombs drop? Are they gone yet?" I grew up in Germany, and my dad's dad used to alert the city for incoming air raids. My grandpa died 3 days before I was born, and at 5 I had no idea about the war, or my grandpa. Really freaked him out at the time. A couple moments later I forgot what I said when he asked me more questions. My coworker has a son who, when he was about 3, told her he used to grow rice and lived in a place where 2 rivers met. He was able to name the rivers, and she located it on a map of East Asia. Pretty wild. My little brother was born just after 9/11. When he was a toddler one time, he went on about how he used to work in a tall building and wore a suit and tie. Freaked my parent out. None of mine have, but back pre-pandemic I was watching my friend's then 3-year-old for her and he saw a big military ship and he got this kind of far away look and said, "I remember when my boat sank. There were so many sharks." I said, "What?" He blinked, said, "What?" and then started asking questions about the boat. I mentioned it to my friend and she said, "Yeah, he does that sometimes." My little brother said when he was 3 or 4, "When I was a grown-up, I went to war, and I never came back." When our son was maybe 3 or 4, he described his life as a ballerina on stage, from the lights, to the music, to the applause. His next words chilled me to the bone. "I was at a party on a boat, and I fell into the water, then poof, I was here." I asked him to relate the story when his father came back from a business trip a couple weeks later, and it was identical. But after that we never discussed it again. I didn't want to go there. Additional reply: she just finished studying at ballet school, was on a boat celebrating a friend's birthday that would later sink on the River Thames after being struck by a barge. Over 50 people tragically died that night. I'm late to this post, but I fully believe that my son is my grandfather v.2. Here are a couple examples, but there's so many more I could share. When my son was about 3, I took him to my grandma's house a few states away for the first time. Upon entering a house he'd never been in, he immediately toddled over to her, placed his chubby baby hand on her cheek and said, "I have missed you so much, Annie." Then he crawled in her lap, patted her hand and said, "I really liked your black hair more." Several years prior, my grandmother, Anne, stopped coloring her hair, let it go white, and started wearing a wig. No one but Grandpa called her Annie, ever. A while later he was walking down the hall and saw a picture of my grandpa in the military band. He stopped at the photo and said, "That was when I was playing in the band," while pointing directly at my grandpa. At the age of 3, my son had never really been told about Grandpa other than he wasn't here anymore. I also had no pictures of my grandfather as a young man anywhere in our home. Preschooler having detailed understanding of mass executions via guillotine. He described a large field with many guillotines. And their blades all came down together in a mass execution. He was among them. I spooked my parents when I was about 3. Okay, this is a little complicated. I'm adopted. When my, soon-to-be adoptive, parents were working with a social worker, my mom said that they'd be happy with any child, but that she had always wanted a red-haired girl. So the social worker was pretty excited to tell her that there were 2 red-haired baby girls up for adoption just then. My parents came to see me at the foster home, and that was that they never met the other red-haired baby. Fast forward a few years. I'm in a preschool class with another red-haired girl. My parents start talking to her as find out that she was also adopted. She's the other baby the social worker mentioned. Weird, but cool, right? My parents were always open about my adoption as much as you can explain to a 3-year-old, anyway, but the other girl's parents hadn't told her. So my parents didn't say anything until the end of the year, when the other girl's family was moving away. When my dad told me, "Hey, guess what, X was adopted, too," I just responded, "Yeah, I know." When questioned about how I could know that, I said, "X and me knew each other in heaven." Apparently, I explained that before we were here, we were waiting with the other babies. I told him that we watched people and decided which family to go to. X and me decided to be adopted and to meet each other on Earth. It's probably just a kid's silliness, but it's kind of a nice idea, I think. Not a parent, but I miscarried at 19. It was a deeply traumatic time in my life. I was far along enough to know it would have been a girl. I had nightmares about the little girl I lost. Years later a toddler comes running right up into my arms saying she was really good friends with Naomi. And that she's completely fine and looks good. And she's sorry she just wasn't ready yet. It terrified me because I never told anyone about the name I would have given my daughter. Her parents said there's no one in her daycare named Naomi, so it must have been an imaginary friend. Little late and I'm not the parent, but my boyfriend really freaked his dad out one time when he was around 2 or 3 years old. He's always disliked being around horses, despite growing up around them. His dad is a blacksmith, and I think this is why. He said he was in the car and woke up suddenly from his nap and crying, and his dad asked what was wrong and he said he had just remembered how he died. He was a cowboy, described his outfit, and the horse he had been riding got startled by a snake and buck throwing him off. He broke his collarbone and couldn't get it fixed properly, so it became septic and he died from it. Needless to say, his dad was a little spooked that his 2/3 3-year-old knew all these terms he'd never heard of in his life. After recounting the story, apparently my boyfriend went right back to sleep. Very recently I was actually talking to my parents about past life memories after I read this really interesting article. They ended up telling me about a past life memory I had aged 5. They actually seemed a tad worried talking about it, but as they don't have read it I will relay it, and just to be clear, I have no memory of this myself. So aged 5, my parents brought me one of them toy police cars. I spent a little while playing in it but apparently didn't seem happy. My parents asked why I didn't seem to be liking it, and I apparently told them I didn't like it because I remember being stabbed inside a car like this before I came here. I said my skin was black then though. They said they were a bit taken aback by this and just didn't speak any more about it. But then a while later my granddad came round and wanted me to show him my new toy. At this point my parents tell me I refused to get in it, saying something like what I said to them. Apart from this time I said something more along the lines of I wasn't going to get in it because when I drove it before I came here I was stabbed and it hurt. I take it from how they speak about it that to them this seemed pretty weird. I understand that because it makes me feel weird as well. Out of curiosity I thought I'd Google and try find if any police officers died from stab wounds around the time I was born. Now I was born in the blank and blank. I am sure that many police officers die in the line of duty each year, but one did stand out. Blank. The date when I was born had one registered police death. The officer was black and died after being stabbed to death in his own patrol car. I'll answer for my grandpa since he passed sadly. My dad and uncle said to me that when I was 3 or 4 I once looked at my grandpa and said, "JB, don't you remember when we went bar hopping in Australia, between island campaigns during the war, and I tried to flirt with the brown hair Australian girl before I died on that island?" Apparently I said that, and my grandpa admitted that during World War II, him and a friend went bar hopping and one of his closest friends tried to flirt with a brown-haired Australian girl, and died in the Philippines. According to them my grandpa never told them, let alone me, about that. Also JB was my grandpa's initials he went by, but I didn't know that yet. My little brother, around 2 or 3 at the time, started speaking fluent, or as fluent as a toddler can be, Arabic one day in the back of the car. I only learned it was actual Arabic instead of baby babble because I had Google Assistant open to change the song on my playlist when he spoke, and Google heard it and registered everything. The search results said it was an Arabic death prayer. Based on my searches, I assume it was the last thing he heard. At least he went out surrounded by friends and family.